All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the Vandenberg Coalition and FDD Action for today's event, which is titled Taking the Iran Threat Seriously, Policy Options for Congress to Hold the Islamic Republic Accountable. I know that I don't need to inform those of you in this room of this, but over the last year, the world has really been transfixed by what most describe as an ongoing conventional war being fought between Iranian proxies against the state of Israel. But as we know, that characterization is incomplete. The war is being waged not by proxies, but by the Iranian regime itself, and its target is not solely against Israel. It is the United States and the American-led system. And while conventional weapons are, of course, a key factor in this ongoing war, we've lost focus on yet another Iranian threat, which is its growing nuclear program. Recent reports suggest that Iran has enough stockpiles of 60% and 20% enriched uranium to make over 8 bombs, to say nothing of the assessment that they are now enriching at 83.7% purity. By comparison, the average enrichment of the bomb used in Hiroshima was 80%. That's why most observers today now conclude that the Iranian breakout is a mere days away. This is the context in which the Vandenberg Coalition and FDD Action released a public letter, which you see on your seats here, that was signed by over a dozen separate organizations, including Kufi Action, the Republican Jewish Coalition, Veterans on Duty, United Against Nuclear Iran Action, National Union for Democracy in Iran, the Philos Project, Advancing American Freedom, Texas-Israel Alliance, and the Zionist Organization of America, calling for a comprehensive set of policies that will better defend American interests against the Iranian threat. This is also the context in which we are meeting today to discuss these proposals in more detail and collectively consider additional means of preventing Iranian aggression. Today, we're thrilled to have a panel with leading Iran experts to dive into these questions and recommendations. It's my honor to introduce Nick Stewart, FDD Action's Senior Director of Government Relations and a former Chief of Staff to the State Department's Iran Action Group, who will be moderating this important discussion and introducing the panelists. Thank you once again to FDD Action for co-sponsoring this event, to our panelists for taking the time to share their insights, and of course to all of you for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Carrie. And we'll get started here. So let me introduce our distinguished panelists, and then we'll go ahead. We have a lot of topics to cover. Oh, and you did bring. I was going to ask if you were bringing. Okay, awesome. And we have the props. Thank you. Great. So I'll start by introducing the panelists, and then we'll have a 40-minute conversation, which will be on the record and filmed, and then we'll turn the camera off and we'll have an off-the-record conversation where you can ask questions, and we want to get you guys involved in the conversation. All right, so first, Elliott Abrams is the chairman of the Vandenberg Coalition. He also serves as the senior fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. He served as special assistant to the president and NSC Senior Director for the Near East and North Africa in the first term of George W. Bush, and is Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor in the second term. Most importantly, he also served as my boss for a brief period of time in the Trump administration, where he was very brief.
It's your fault.
He was a tough guy to work for, right? A special representative for Iran and Venezuela. So thank you for being here, Elliott. And then Behnam Ben Taleblu is a colleague of mine. He works as a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. Prior to his time at FDD, Behnam worked on non-proliferation issues at an arms control think tank in Washington, and there is no one better in Washington or probably the Western Hemisphere on Iran's missile threat. So we're very excited to have you here, Behnam. And last but certainly not least, Cameron Khansarinia. I was grappling with that one today. And Cameron is vice president of the National Union for Democracy in Iran, known as NUFDI. Having previously served as their policy director. As vice president, he leads the organization's special projects, high-level relationships, and strategic growth initiatives, and regularly briefs members of Congress and leaders in Washington, across Europe, and around the Middle East on Iran issues and geopolitics in the region. So thank you for being here too, Cameron. All right, so let's get started. As a reminder, like I said, we're on the record for this portion of the conversation, and then we'll go off the record so you guys can ask some questions. Elliott, I wanted to start with you. So in your last role as special representative for Iran and Venezuela, a key responsibility of yours was to calibrate pressure on America's adversaries. And the contrast between then and now, frankly, couldn't be more stark. with regard to Iran and with regard to Venezuela. But that's a conversation for another time, although we were just talking about the many ways in which that's changed too dramatically. Yep. So Iran's oil exports, they hit a 6-year high a few months back. The regime is bringing in $35 billion annually, as much as $100 billion since Joe Biden took office in January 2021. And the lack of enforcement has been a deliberate decision, right? This isn't by accident. So how big of a mistake has that been, and how important is it for Congress to exert greater pressure on the administration to enforce existing sanctions?
Thanks. For the on-the-record portion, I'm tempted to say no comment. But it's been a huge mistake. And I think for a direct reason and for a broader reason. The direct reason is simply money. You can buy a lot with $100 billion. Obviously, some of that money has to be directed toward the Iranian population because the regime knows it's a population that hates it, but not all of it. So the more they have, the more they can spend on the IRGC and Hezbollah and the Houthis and Hamas, et cetera. So, I mean, that's the direct effect. The indirect effect, which is at least as large, is what it tells the regime about the United States and about American policy. How dedicated are we to reining in this malign behavior by Iran? And if the answer is, we're going to bankrupt you, we're going to prevent you from exporting oil to the full extent we can until some of this stops, that's a potent message. And if the message from the behavior is, look, we have lots of priorities, and, we don't want to have arguments with China, and, well, it's only money. I mean, the message there is that the seriousness of the U.S. effort to prevent Iran from creating chaos in the Middle East has come down an enormous amount.
Thank you. Behnam, I now have the prop, so this was perfect. You recently published what I consider a very comprehensive monograph here with some colleagues from FDD. It's called Deterring Iran's Dash to the Bomb. It's on FDD's website. I encourage you all to take a look at it. I think we need to put a finer point, and we'll talk a little bit about this, on the escalation and the advancement of Iran's nuclear program, right? In November 2020, the time that it was estimated to take Iran to produce the weapons-grade uranium for a single bomb was about 3.5 months. Today, we're looking at about 7 days, right? So that's over 90% decline in Iran's breakout time. That's what we're dealing with, and that's why you focused on this monograph. What can we do to deter Iran at this late stage? And you offered several specific recommendations in here, and we'll get to some of those later in the conversation. But I think just as important, your piece laid out key principles for deterring Iran based on previous successful efforts, right? Pressure is more, it's not just sanctions, it's what can we do to bring a successful policy together? So according to your analysis, what are the core principles that make pressure and that make deterrence toward Iran successful beyond just the implementation of sanctions, right? What works? And I think you did a fantastic job in this at really pulling that apart.
Well, thank you, Nick. It's an honor to be here and share the not virtual but the real stage with some real Iran watchers and experts who've implemented this stuff over the years. Let me just make the situation slightly worse for you all, because it's not just that massive change in the breakout time, which you can play with by increasing more or less or bringing more centrifuges, but there have unfortunately been real knowledge-based gains made by the Islamic Republic in the past 2.5, 3 years that deal or no deal, bomb or no bomb, war or no war, will remain with the Islamic Republic. So you can change a capability, but there has unfortunately been real knowledge-based gains. How to enrich to 60%, the correct phasing of the cascades of the centrifuges to retain this volume of output, the games that they can play, production of uranium metal to 20% purity, which is stand-in for weapons grade, something this regime has no real civilian need for. This is the modeling of a potential core for a future nuclear weapon, and the Islamic Republic has been doing this in plain sight since the Biden administration entered office and since these sanctions that Elliott just mentioned have gone unenforced. So unfortunately, the situation is bleak. I can elaborate on why it's more bleak in the Q&A. But some of the lessons, unfortunately, there's only a handful of lessons in the history of the 45-year lifespan of the Islamic Republic where they have backed down. The famous ones, ending the Iran-Iraq War, agreeing to the JCPOA. We all know those. But in this, we lay out a few other lesser-known ones where sometimes a brief show of force early on, very early in a conflict, if the Islamic Republic assesses the willingness, just the willingness, that resolve that Elliott talked about, if it assesses that willingness, that seriousness to use force, it will back down. We've identified a few of those instances in this paper. Conversely, if you ever do get to a situation, and this is where the polite criticism comes in, where you do end up using force, unless the regime signals there's a willingness to counterpunch, it will race you. And this actually happened under the Trump administration. Famously, does anyone know when the biggest ballistic missile barrage the U.S. faced in its history since the end of World War II was? Exactly, right after we killed Qasem Soleimani at our positions in Iraq. And the U.S. did not respond to the biggest ballistic missile barrage on our forces in history. So this is a bad lesson we've given the Islamic Republic. So when you throw a punch, be ready to throw the counterpunch, and perhaps don't throw that first punch if you're not ready to do the counterpunch. Elsewhere, deterrence by detection can actually do a great job. If you see something, this is not the New York City subway, but if you see something, say something. This summer, you may know a story reported once in June and reported once in July in Axios. Basically, U.S. and Israeli intelligence had detected that there was computer modeling going on and some metallurgy work going on, work relevant to the development of a nuclear weapon, weaponization adjacent or weaponization-like studies. Fortunately, it was detected. Unfortunately, it wasn't brought to the attention of the world. It was leaked in a press story. The U.S. government didn't go out there formally to say it, but it detected the activity and it engaged in deterrence by detection, basically saying, if you think you're getting away with this by doing it in private, please know that we're watching you and we're catching and we'll do something about it. So deterrence by detection can play a great job in shaping the Islamic Republic's calculus. One of the other big lessons is that this is a regime that's retained the title of the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism for 4 decades. They've actually had a very consistent foreign and security policy, and we need to be equally consistent, the left and the right. It's not bipartisan. We need a nonpartisan approach to countering the full spectrum of threats from the Islamic Republic. And that is, too, a signal of our will or of our resolve. If we can't socialize this with our friends and partners across the other side of the aisle, they will know that we don't mean well, and all they will have to do is to just wait us out. Left and right, right and left. Hawkishness to dovishness, dovishness to hawkishness. So those are some core principles: consistency, effort, resolve, deterrence by punishment, deterrence by detection that can help.
Well, we'll come back to it because we're going to get into the specific recommendations, and I think there's a lot more we can unpack. Cameron, I want to come over to you. You were a signatory, NUFDI was, of the Vandenberg Coalition and FDD Action letter, and one of the things you helped us put a very fine point on was that maximum pressure is great, maximum pressure is necessary, but maximum support to the Iranian people is also a very important part of a comprehensive strategy. And I think the pendulum often swings toward pressure, not enough toward support. So what can Congress be doing to support the Iranian people's organic movement for democracy while maintaining the pressure? What does a successful maximum support policy look like?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you, Mr. Abrams, and Ben. I'm a good friend. Let me say at the beginning that I'd like your forgiveness for being the best person when it comes to horse analogies, because I'm probably going to beat a dead horse or just be a one-trick pony in terms of what I'm going to keep coming back to, which is the root of all of these problems that we're going to discuss today is the existence of the Islamic Republic. It is not the behavior of the Islamic Republic, because the Islamic Republic, through its 45 years of existence, has shown its unwillingness and its inability to change. It is fundamentally a revolutionary regime. Iranian courts are Islamic Revolutionary courts. The IRGC is not the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, it is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So it's important to keep this in mind for all the things that we'll hear today and going forward. So again, forgive me for both beating the dead horse and merely being a one-trick pony compared to my estimable and much more broadly capable colleagues on this panel. The first thing that's important to note about maximum support is that maximum support is not a replacement of maximum pressure. We view it as a second step and as a critical partner to maximum pressure. Indeed, the two work hand in hand. When you pressure the Islamic Republic, you're supporting the Iranian people, because the weaker the regime is, the greater chance the Iranian people have to be victorious over the Islamic Republic. And likewise, when you support the Iranian people, you're pressuring the Islamic regime. As the Iranian people go stronger, as they have more abilities at their disposal to use, the regime is comparably weaker. So these are not replacements for one another. Indeed, they work hand in hand as we see it, and we think they should work hand in hand when it comes to policy. Before I get into a few specific examples as to what the Congress can do, as we view maximum support, and we also put out a second version, which was co-authored with our friends at FDD, it begins with a statement of policy. Now, I have no qualms. I don't think that my friends and colleagues on this panel do have about the term regime change, but maybe some people do have some qualms with that statement or that phrase. What we can do instead is start with a very basic premise that the United States, be it the President of the United States and the executive branch, or be it the Congress, supports the Iranian people's democratic aspirations. It's very simple. We are not looking to determine the future for the Iranian people. We are not looking to determine who their future leader ought to be, simply supporting their democratic aspirations. If and when they are successful in overthrowing the regime, it should be their democratic prerogative to choose their future form of government, their future leader, etc. So we can start with that very basic point. And it's important, not only because he's in the room, but to give credit to the previous administration, particularly the two special envoys for Iran, Mr. Hook and Mr. Abrams, for, with that rhetoric, being very clear. For example, your video on Cyrus the Great Day spoke an immense amount to the people of Iran. When the special envoy for the United States, the Iranian people don't just see it as the State Department's special envoy, but the United States government's special envoy to them, delivers a message, a video message on Cyrus the Great Day, and tells them, we support your movement for freedom. That means an immense amount to Iranians inside the country. And maybe you think it's just a video message, but this is not something that's unique to Iran. It's something that, for example, the famous Soviet dissident Natan Sharansky once said, that when he was sitting in the Soviet prisons, he began to see the light at the end of the tunnel when President Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire. So when we as the United States say that the Islamic Republic is an evil regime, it's not just a foe, it's not just somebody we're competing with. It is an evil regime. It wants to wipe Israel off the map. It wants to assassinate the former president of the United States and destroy this country. And it's slaughtering innocent Iranians every single day. I think it's okay to call an entity that does that an evil regime. And I think it's okay to say, yes, ideally, those kind of guys should not be in power. I don't think that's a really crazy thing to say. The Overton window should be able to accept such a statement. So when you start with that sort of rhetoric, you can then begin to go into specific policies, which I'm happy to get into, from supporting Iranian workers and laborers with the strike fund. But frankly, of the 15 points that NUFDI has in our maximum support strategy and the 10 points that are in the joint FDD NUFDI one, I think if you can even get the rhetoric right, and you choose one of those 10 or 15, you will be a long way to empowering Iranians to be able to overthrow this regime themselves. The last thing I'll say is Iranians aren't sitting on the sidelines hoping that America overthrows the regime for them. They have shown that they are willing to risk their lives. They are willing to be shot. They're willing to be blinded. They're willing to have their schools poisoned and gassed to free themselves. I think what they want is two things. One, for our government and for other governments to stop enabling and helping their oppressors, as the Biden administration has done by not enforcing the sanctions, among many other things. And two, to give them a little bit of support, even if it's vocal support at the beginning. So don't help their oppressors first, and second, support their basic and fundamental democratic aspirations.
Just piggybacking on something you said, the messaging, I was always shocked at how our messaging and the previous administration's messaging, a lot of the messaging that you did, penetrated in the engagement that it got from not just the diaspora here, but you could see, on the backside, you could see where people are engaging from, and it really engaged Iranians across the spectrum and across the globe in really amazingly productive ways.
May I add two very brief data points on that point? President Trump's tweet in Persian when Iranian protesters were on the street saying, people of Iran, we support you. We support your democratic aspirations, is the #1 most liked tweet in Persian in Twitter history. #1.
Really?
Yes, #1. And secondly, the State Department's USA Dar, now USA Be Farsi account, was one of the top 10 most engaged with social media accounts, not only in Persian, in all of Twitter. Because what Iranians saw was the beacon for, maybe for us, it's sort of, oh God, we've heard this, we're a shining city on the hill, and that's so blasé, and that is true for people who don't live near K Street, or who don't live in San Francisco or New York.
K Street's not so shiny. Let me just tell you.
We are the shining city, and that means a lot. And to see the U.S. government sharing those messages means more, I think, that perhaps any of us, myself included, in this room can fathom.
Did you want to say?
I remember the Cyrus
Yeah.
thing, and you never know. Somebody says, sometimes it was you, sometimes it was VOA, you should do this. And of course, my thought was, well, there's no downside. Of course I should do it. But does it get through? Does it have an impact? And I think the Sharansky analogy is a very good one, because I think we have enough evidence now to know that it really does matter. The obverse side of that coin was the terrible way we, the United States, reacted in 2009, 2014, for which you'd have to say President Obama himself has recognized his own mishandling.
Yeah. And I want to stay with you because this is Unga Week in New York City, the UN General Assembly, and Iran's new president, Masoud Pezeshkian, is running around New York, touting diplomacy, and I'm a reformer, and the media is magnifying that exactly as Iran had hoped. They even brought out Zarif from retirement, right? So there is this narrative that Iran is turning the chapter on, the butcher of Tehran, and there's a new president, there's a new reformer in town. Obviously, it shouldn't be much of a newsflash. Pezeshkian is a part of the theocratic, tyrannical, authoritarian government of Iran, right? This man is not a reformer, and we shouldn't buy into that narrative, because what it does is it throws us off our guard, and we think, this is different. This is a new. What do you say to that? Because that impacts policy, right? If we think that we have an honest broker across the table, we are coming to the table with a completely different mindset, and I think it's important we disabuse people of that notion. Speak to that, and I think if anybody else wants to chime in on this too.
If Mr. Pezeshkian is a reformer, then I'm, Queen Elizabeth. I think that the notion that the Islamic Republic has, quite effectively, to their credit, sold the world on, and this has been one of Mr. Khamenei's master classes. I mean, he's an old radical cleric, but the guy gets, or has people who get, the West and Western media and Western quote-unquote elite circles extremely well. Whatever Javad Zarif is being paid, it is far, far below what he is worth to the Islamic Republic. I mean, if you think back to the articles the New York Times was writing about the guy saying, Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister who likes cappuccinos, and it makes you not want to pull your hair out, but pull your eyes out. I mean, it's so ridiculous, but also so insulting, I think, to people who are fighting for freedom. It's also so insulting, it should be, at least for us as Americans, I would think. Very briefly on the reform movement in Iran, there was undoubtedly a time, 20 years ago or so, when Iranians inside the country thought that the least costly way for them to get some more social freedoms, some political freedoms, perhaps some improved economic situation for themselves and their families, was through reform within the system. They did think that somebody like Mohammad Khatami, the quote-unquote first reformist, could bring about some change in the late 1990s, early 2000s. But very immediately, we saw protests at Iranian universities, chiefly Tehran University, and the slogans were all at Mr. Khatami. Khatami, come to the streets, join us. If you're a man, come on the streets. If you're a patriot, come on the streets. And Khatami chose Ali Khamenei over the people of Iran. So the reformist project failed because of either one or two things, and it can't be anything other than these. Either it did not actually want to bring about any reforms, or it was structurally unable to bring about any reforms. So this has been going on for now more than half of the Islamic Republic's existence. If these reformists wanted to bring about change, or were able to bring about change, they would have done so. They are neither willing nor are they capable. And that's why on the streets of Iran, one of the most common slogans we now hear is reformists, hardliners, the game is over. We're no longer buying what you're trying to sell us. And so Mr. Pezeshkian is not able structurally to bring about any change. It's like a kid saying that, my dad lets me eat candy, and the dad comes home and says, no, you can't eat candy. The dad is Mr. Khamenei. Khamenei is the decider. Khamenei sets the policy, and his policies, not just his slogans, are death to Israel, death to America, and let me kill Iranians. That's the policy. Mr. Pezeshkian does not want to change it. He cannot change that. He is sent out, like Zarif is, by Khamenei to sell a different image, to sell the notion of a honest broker to the West. It will never happen, and I think that increasingly people will recognize that. I hope that President Trump recognizes that, because I think that at least some of the rhetoric we hear from President Trump is the JCPOA was a bad deal. I can make a great deal. You cannot make a great deal with the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic will cheat, lie, and steal, and laugh all the way to the bank at our expense as Americans and at the expense of the Iranian people. So I hope that whoever wins the upcoming election realizes that Mr. Pezeshkian is not a real partner. Mr. Khamenei will never be a real partner unless you just want photo ops. If you want real results, you have to impose maximum pressure on the regime and offer maximum support to the Iranian people. Otherwise, we'll be talking about the Iran problem for 45 more years.
There are people in Iran who I think deserve to be regarded as reformists or potential reformists. Some have been killed, some are in prison, and Mousavi and Karoubi have been under house arrest for 8 years or something like that now. So if the supreme leader decides you should be president, you are not a reformist.
And I think that's the essence. That's what we need to continue to shout from the rooftops, because the Zarif and the Pezeshkian effect is powerful in Europe. It is powerful in the media. And Behnam.
Just a footnote, or to borrow from Cameron, to beat a dead horse. Mr. Pezeshkian actually tried to run for the presidency in 2021, and he was disqualified by the Guardian Council. So Khamenei, again, is like a master chef. Everything has a time and a place. 2021 was not Mr. Pezeshkian's time or place. 2024 is. And one reason why it is, and again, not to beat another dead horse or talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room, is the nuclear issue. Your last best hope to use diplomacy against the Islamic Republic of Iran, to use economic measures against the Islamic Republic of Iran, to get the world to respect not just the weight of American sanctions, but the political clout of what we say and the policies that we set, will expire on the Iran nuclear threat come October 2025, when the snapback mechanism in the UN Security Council Resolution 2231 expires. Because from then on out, guess what? Russia is Iran's lawyer on the UN Security Council. And if you want to ever slightly broaden the coalition for pressure, if you want to take max pressure, max support, and multilateralize it, and don't let the Zarifs or the Pezeshkians or the Arakchis or whomever else they put up divide us from ourselves on the left and the right, and divide us from our partners, whether they're in the GCC or in the European Union. You need to build a multilateral baseline for pressure. And some of the own goals of the Islamic Republic are helping us. Remember, there was a time when the European Union was to America's right on the nuclear issue, on the human rights issue. That was when Iran in 2010 was producing 20% enriched uranium. In 2009-10 cracked down on the Green Movement. And in 2011 talked about closing the Strait of Hormuz. Well, guess what? It's 2024, and they've cracked down on the Massa movement. They've enriched and stockpiled to 60% purity and have enriched in the past to 84% purity. And the threat is in the maritime domain is not just limited to the Strait of Hormuz and Persian Gulf. It's in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden now. So the threat has expanded. It's time that we catch up with the threat.
Thanks. Elliott, I want to come to you on the topic of sanctions. Obviously, the Islamic Republic of Iran is a heavily sanctioned country. The United States, the executive, the president, we have an abundance of authorities, right? We could be imposing severe pressure. We talked about at the onset all the reasons, all the problems with not doing that. There's a practical issue too, though, and I think we've seen this inside government, right? Iran, we're talking, especially the lucrative Iran-China oil trade, right? We are talking about big actors. Are they too big to sanction? Or what are the secondary effects of sanctioning X actor? What are the second? And as you sit around, you've been in your fair share of Security Council meetings, right? Where you have Treasury saying, we can't touch it, right? You have all the stakeholders sitting around a table. And we find ourselves, I think, in a similar spot today. We were kind of getting there at the tail end of the last administration, and I'm sure these discussions are being had, and they're difficult conversations because there is those secondary and third order effects of sanctions against some bigger targets. So how do you address that? How do members of Congress and their staffs think through pressing the administration to sanction, right? Because we're risk averse. And Iran is leveraging that to its advantage. And if we don't plug that hole, they're going to continue to do it. So how do we respond? How do we answer that question? Well, this is too big.
Well, I'm tempted
sanction.
to answer. How about responding courageously?
Well, let's do
This
it.
is the United States of
We're on the
America.
record.
We look at what happened after the invasion of Ukraine. What can we do? It's Russia. They're threatening. It's a nuclear power. Yet we and the Europeans imposed very significant sanctions, and they've had a pretty good impact, which is to say a pretty bad impact on the Russian economy. Is China too big to sanction? No. Now, multilateral sanctions are always going to be more effective, and that is why I think snapback is so critical here, because I think there are a lot of countries that whose initial reaction to being told you must join the sanctions against China on the sale of Iranian oil to China, will back away or be very nervous about it. But if it's UN sanctions, they have an excuse. Then they can say to the Chinese, well, we've never violated multilateral sanctions like this. We can't. It's in our laws. It's in our... So I think that's the first point. Snapback is relevant, and simply being willing to say to the Chinese, we're doing it. Second point, and it picks up on something you were saying. In my experience on a lot of these sanctions issues, there's always a lot of resistance in Treasury. Why is that? I would argue that it is not coincidental that many of the officials at Treasury who are resistant come from Wall Street. They come from Wall Street where they and their firms made a lot of money trading with China, investing in China. Now, okay, the bloom is a bit off the rose. It should be less difficult in 2025, let's say, than it was 10 years ago. The American people as a whole and the American government as a whole are much more aware now of the threat from China. And our engagement with the Chinese economy and our potential engagement is much lower now than it was 10 years ago. But there's still plenty there. And I think this is where Congress comes in. I think Congress should not be in a position of saying, to an administration through letters from 10 or 110 members, gee, we think you should legislate it. Legislate it so that those who favor sanctions just have to point to a law rather than pleading with Treasury officials or commerce officials or USTR officials. We really should be doing this because relations with Iran require it. So I think we're seeing movement with respect to U.S.-Chinese economic, commercial, financial relations anyway. I would have worried a lot more years ago, but now I think we clearly can do it. And where is the money coming from for Iran? It's coming from China. So if you're thinking of trying to sanction Iran, if you think that is an important tool, you have to deal with the oil trade with China. Otherwise, you're dealing with 10% rather than 90%.
And I'll put a plug in for the National Security Act that was passed in April and included several provisions, the SHIP Act being one of them, bipartisan, and another measure that actually lowered the significance threshold so we could go after a lot more of this trade. The problem is the administration's blowing past a lot of the deadlines and we're not seeing action. So Congress, I think that was a huge step forward and they're beginning to legislate on it. We just got to continue to hold.
I should, because I think some people don't recognize what does this mean. And here I give credit, for example, to you, your team, Brian Hook. What does it mean to enforce sanctions? One of the things it means is to call up and talk to ship captains and say, you pilot that ship from Iran to China, Indonesia. whatever false port it is, you will never be able to pilot a ship to an American port in your life. You'll be on a blacklist. It's calling insurance companies and saying, if you insure that shipment of oil, that's the last time you deal with American cargo. It's not brain surgery. We know how to do it. It requires willpower.
May I just say very briefly, I think that in addition to China, which I'm no expert in, one area that will require more courage in a potential administration that would want to implement these sanctions is America's partners in the Arab world. There has to be a willingness to call the Emiratis and say, you cannot continue to facilitate illegal Iranian transactions. I think part of their unwillingness to do so is, to a degree, our own fault. Another mistake, in addition to the one that Behnam made in terms of not being willing to respond, was not defending our friends in Saudi Arabia after they came under terrible attack from the Islamic Republic. So to the extent that we did not defend them, it's not so surprising that Riyadh and Tehran have reestablished diplomatic relations. They don't feel, as we would say in Persian, that their foot is on a sturdy place. I'm sure there's a better English expression that I'm
thought you'd have a horse metaphor.
Yeah, well, beyond horses now. So we have to be able to also push our Arab friends. In order to push our Arab friends, we have to support our Arab friends if we expect something from them.
Just very briefly, there's a few areas where, hypothetically, regardless of who wins, if max pressure is back tomorrow, if you don't course correct these areas, the Islamic Republic will continue not just to survive, but thrive, even as U.S. sanctions remain on the books. Area number one, obviously, that's oil, and that's China. Area number two is, this is really a change in the past decade. The Islamic Republic is a petrochemical powerhouse, petrochemical trade. Three, as Cameron just mentioned, the regional trade. When you look at the countries that were buying petrochemicals, some were in the region, some were not. Many of them have good relationships with the U.S. Even at the peak of max pressure, the countries that were buying were allegedly, I believe, UAE, Oman, Turkey, Malaysia. That's a big problem, but that can be handled diplomatically. The next is the ship-to-ship transfers in jurisdictions outside Malaysia. And then finally is the non-dollar denominated trading. This is the kind of stuff that Iran is going to start to do with Russia now, and Russia is going to start to do en masse the more we use sanctions against it. So finding a workaround to put pressure on those who do bartering for the Islamic Republic, who do hawala for the Islamic Republic, and then plugging these other holes. This is sometimes denigrated by deal defenders and sanctions skeptics as, well, it is like playing with Russian nesting dolls. It is like playing with Russian nesting dolls, but you have to be willing to go all the way. And that is that willingness to enforce over time. And if you don't identify the balance sheet, what worked 2018 to 20, what didn't work, what functioned as a support valve, we're going to hit the ground losing in 2025 if max pressure is back at the helm, if we don't course correct for the changes in the Iranian economy and in the way it's been illicitly interacting with the outside world.
And what did work, in building on your point about the Gulf, as we took, during max pressure, Iranian oil off the market, our Gulf strategy was about bringing supply on the market to calibrate. Look, Americans are price sensitive, and oil is a commodity. So it is about that balance, but we demonstrated it can be done. Now we have Russia, and that's created different supply challenges, but it certainly can be done.
We ourselves are now producing much more than we were producing ever before.
Right.
So we should be able to counteract whatever problem we would face by cutting off Iranian oil.
It's worth saying, just as a kind of market point, we're not going to be able to cut Iranian oil exports, Iranian oil sales to zero. But as you push the sanctions, as you enforce the sanctions, what happens? The Iranians are forced to sell the oil at a discount. And the more we push, the greater the discount is and the less money they get.
And this was one, okay.
Yeah.
This just on the discount, this was, Congress had a huge role to play here in taking advantage of even illicit traders, 2010 to 2012, first with the CISADA, then the Iran Threat Reduction Act, knowing full well that China was not going to 100% comply. They gave the Chinese the opportunity to have the Islamic Republic over a barrel. When we do calculations at FDD over how much oil revenue is Tehran able to generate, those are variable numbers because no one knows the exact rate of the discount. We price at $5 off the spot price, $10 off the spot price, $15 off the spot price, just to come up with a baseline average. And the more you enforce these penalties, the more the market dynamics can impact Chinese policy to say, hey, if you want us to keep buying, you better give us a bigger discount. So the point is to inflict as many multi-directional losses on the Islamic Republic as possible.
Very briefly on sanctions and inside Iran and the connection there. It's now been nearly 10 years, indeed, from the Cyrus the Great tomb is where the sort of recent protest movement started in Iran, that we've been seeing consistent protests inside the country. And not once in any of these protests, there have been hundreds of chants, a few dozen consistent ones. Not once have you seen Iranians inside the country chant against American sanctions. So for those whose your offices or your members of Congress may come to you and get an angry letter from, I don't know, the Code Pink people or whatever, which I hope you throw immediately in the trash. But if it's from somebody more respectable than Code Pink, and they say, hey, by the way, Iranians, they don't like sanctions, whatever, you have seen Iranians chant lots of things. Death to America, death to Khamenei, death to the Islamic Republic. When the regime puts on loudspeakers and says death to America, death to Israel, Iranians respond, death to Russia, death to China. And when they paint American and Israeli flags on the ground for Iranians to step on, they go around them, they jump over it because they wouldn't want to desecrate it. They chant, our enemy is right here, you lie when you tell us it's America. They have never once chanted against sanctions. So don't let that be a false excuse that anybody comes to you with.
Last footnote, I promise. I know we're going over, but just on this domestic linkage, the Biden administration has rhetorically done a lot to stand with the Iranian people. We have to give them that. But they haven't scaled up by turning their rhetoric into action. And this is really where the Trump administration and where you guys were real trailblazers, because I don't think we can appreciate now, knowing there's a boom and bust cycle of Iranian protests, the cost of the taboo that the Trump administration broke in 2017, 2018 by actually saying my support to people in Iran is not the kiss of death. Winning that battle was uphill both ways in Washington, D.C. Just like sanctioning the IRGC was a 10-year debacle, uphill both ways. This took from 2009 to 2017-18. It was conventional wisdom in this town and on many sides, left and the right, in this building and across other congressional buildings, that American support would be the kiss of death. That was slaughtered, that sacred cow, 2017, 2018, and World War III did not start. So it's critical to pay attention to the right voices. And the right voices in Iran were chanting that phrase Cameron just said as max pressure escalated, torpedoing another thesis, which is that the Iranians would hold foreign governments accountable for the changes in their lifestyle. Instead, the Iranians actually held the Iranian government accountable for the changes in their lifestyle. This, again, torpedoed a second thesis, a second sacred cow. So there are so many unaccounted for wins in the past few years on Iran policy. We can't take this stuff for granted.
We moved from horses to cows, so we're going to go through all the livestock.
Okay, so I want to open it up to you all, but before I do, Behnam, I do want to talk about some of the policy recommendations you have in the monograph, particularly to deter Iran's dash to the bomb, as it's entitled. Can you talk about a couple military or non-military that stand out to you in the monograph that are most applicable to a congressional audience and to the stakeholders here today?
Well, because this is not bipartisan, but it really should be a nonpartisan policy proposition, it's to take advantage of the fact that you've had people on the left and on the right in this building, as well as on the left and the right occupying the White House, who have said it's the policy of the United States of America to prevent a Islamic Republic of Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. It's just connecting the dots between very different people like Bush and Obama and Trump and Biden, and getting whoever next comes into the White House to continue that line and to amplify that. You know, you had Biden, I think in 2022, meet with Prime Minister Bennett in Israel under the auspices of this thing called the Jerusalem Declaration, getting a declaratory statement that it is the official policy of the United States of America, having Congress behind the president on both sides, reflecting that broad bipartisan assessment. You know, that's step number one, getting the message right. Number two is making sure our friends and partners in the region have the means they need to defend themselves. themselves, expediting the military sales to Israel that even as of yesterday, defensive equipment is still being held up, so making sure the Israelis have what they need to defend themselves. C, or the third thing I would say, is making sure that we have the architecture to thwart the most likely options for a delivery vehicle for an Iranian weapon, which would be ballistic missiles, so more integrated air and missile defenses in the region, more exercises. I mean, it's not just the Abraham Accords that was scary for the Islamic Republic. It was that, again, I think late in the Trump administration, Israel was moved into CENTCOM. This is a huge coordination win for militaries where the whole point is logistics can help deter the adversary. If you prove that you have the right logistical architecture in the region, that can alter the risk-reward calculus of the other side. Lastly, this may sound like it's getting too James Bond, too sexy here, but the cyber domain or the covert action domain, if it really is the policy of the United States of America to prevent the Islamic Republic from getting a nuclear weapon, actions in these spaces can actually help shape the thinking of the Islamic Republic to know that wherever they go, they would be caught. And you don't have to take my word for it. A former Iranian intelligence minister said that, Iranian officials should know that they're not sleeping safely at night. That's the level of penetration back a few years ago that they were talking about existed in their country. So I think actually by playing on those fears, by heightening those fears, we could tell them that their world would be a heck of a lot more dangerous and less safe if they took those final steps. The problem is, once the Islamic Republic has done game-changing things like send drones to Russia, we had 2 years to change their risk-reward calculus, that if they followed up with sending missiles, things would get worse. We didn't do that, and the missiles have now come.
Just one point that follows on this. There are no American former officials who need 24/7 protection because they've been threatened by Russia or because they've been threatened by China or by any other hostile regime. Iran is unique in this, and it's really quite unbelievable if you think about it for a minute, that the American reaction is to say, okay, they've threatened the lives of these former officials, we'll give them guards. It's all defense. It's frankly the way we play the Houthis. It's all defense. And that's a mistake because that imposes zero costs on the people who are making those threats, and in the case of the Houthis, those attacks. It's extremely foolish policy.
Super quick footnote to that. I'm sorry, I should have had this in the rundown. Is when your track record is that which the United States currently has, unfortunately, in the region, and this is as an Iranian American who does not want a war with the Islamic Republic, but understands that the Islamic Republic, by denying everyone a limited military option, has enabled for itself a military option, as we've seen in the region since October 7th. Since October 7th, U.S. forces in the region have been hit 176 times. The U.S. has only responded 11 times. So if we're going to get in the business of shaping the decisions of Iranian national security decision makers, including Supreme Leader Khamenei, that's a title meant to be taken very literally, you need to improve the response ratio against the proxies in the region. If you're unwilling to do that, how can your threats elsewhere be perceived as credible?
Yeah.
I would just say briefly, I'm told that this year's election, like the previous election, is one about the future of democracy, and that democracy is under attack or democracy is at risk. The Islamic Republic is every single day undermining our democracy. They are trying to assassinate former senior officials. They're trying to assassinate one of the two candidates for president. They are engaging in significant misinformation and disinformation operations every single day. So the regime is attacking our allies, killing our allies in the region. They are attacking American forces whenever they can, wherever they exist in the region. They are trying to kill senior American officials, a former president of the United States in our country. They are trying to kill Iranian dissidents here, to say nothing of what they do to Iranians back in Iran itself, which is unspeakable. How is this not more of a threat? How is this not something that we're taking more seriously? And to the comparison to Russia and to the question of, well, what can be done, finding more areas to sanction, more ways to support the Iranian people, those who are concerned about the impact of sanctions or the whether sanctions are able to be implemented jumped very quickly into action to sanction like Russian tea houses after Putin invaded Ukraine. There are ways that you can apply existing mechanisms, existing strategies against the Islamic Republic. There is no reason that senior Islamic Republic officials should be living freely or have their children be living freely in the United States, living freely in Canada, have apartments in the south of France, in London, in Paris, or here even in Los Angeles. There's no reason for any of this to be happening. And I would just one more smack at the horse, which is whether it's about the nuclear bomb that the regime may get, whether it's about attempts to assassinate senior officials, whether it's about attempts to undermine our democracy, none of these will ever go away as long as this regime is in power. Maybe they will try to a bit less assassinations and a bit more interfering in our democracy. Maybe it will be more pressure on Israel and less pressure over here. They will move around tactically and strategically in response to whatever the United States does to attempt to hold them accountable or not. But as long as this regime is in power, we are going to continue to face these threats. We should not be still thinking that in some way there's something that we can do to change this regime's behavior. We can change their behavior temporarily, and we should, wherever possible. But it will find a new way to threaten us. There is no way to move the Islamic Republic off its ultimate strategy, which again is the destruction of the State of Israel, the destruction of the United States, and destroying the country of Iran. We shouldn't forget that.
And the degree to which we have accepted and normalized Iran's behavior is stunning and truly without parallel. I mean, I can't think of anything. It's a head scratcher.
Befuddling.
It is befuddling.